Welcome to our deep dive. Today we're taking a trip back in time to 14th century England with excerpts you've shared from Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales.
A really vibrant work.
Yeah, it's amazing, and we're going to try to figure out, what we can learn about these pilgrims heading to Canterbury. What can their stories tell us about, life in the Middle Ages?
And I think what's so fascinating about the Canterbury Tales is just this incredibly diverse cast of characters. We have a knight, we have a wife of Bath who has some pretty interesting opinions on marriage, as we'll find out. We have a really sincere parson. And then we have a whole host of other figures. We have a friar who maybe isn't quite as saintly as you might expect.
Right.
We have a cook who's got some tricks up his sleeve, and we even have a miller who's well known for telling some pretty racy tales.
Yeah, it's really like a snapshot of medieval society. We've got all these different people from all different walks of life coming together.
Yeah.
And the stories they tell, I mean, they really run the gamut. There's romance, there's comedy, there's, kind of these moral fables, and all of it paints this really vivid picture of what life was like back then.
It does. So the setting is April at the Tabard Inn in Southwark. And our narrator is actually Chaucer himself. He's joining this group of 29 other pilgrims. And what's really interesting is that they're not necessarily traveling companions to start with. They're all heading to the shrine of Thomas Becket at Canterbury.
Yeah.
But it seems like this is a fairly spontaneous kind of gathering.
Right, it's not like some pre-planned tour group or anything.
Right, exactly.
And then the innkeeper, the host, he comes up with this brilliant idea, this scheme, really, to keep everyone entertained on this journey.
Yeah, he proposes that each pilgrim tell two stories on the way to Canterbury and then two more on the way back. But, and here's the kicker, anyone who refuses to participate in this storytelling pact has to pay for everyone else's expenses for the whole trip.
That is high stakes.
Wow.
Talk about an incentive to tell some good stories.
Yeah, no kidding. And then how do they decide who goes first? I mean, there's 30 people there.
Well, they draw straws.
Oh, very simple.
Very simple.
Yeah.
And the honor or maybe the burden falls to the knight?
Okay, so let's meet some of these characters. You mentioned the friar before.
Yes.
What do we need to know about this guy right off the bat?
Well, the friar is a bit of a complex character. He's described as someone who loves pleasure, loves a good time, which maybe doesn't exactly fit with your image of a religious man.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, he's also, he lives by begging. He has to solicit alms, and he seems to be quite good at it.
He's got a certain set of skills. He does. And we're told that he's very much inclined to, gossip and to flatter people. He even arranges marriages sometimes covering the dowry himself. And he seems to have a particular fondness for, wealthy landowners and worthy women, as Chaucer puts it.
Right, so he's kind of curating his social circle a little bit.
He is.
Oh.
And he's very strategic about it.
Yeah.
And then when it comes to confession, he claims that he actually has, a higher authority than other friars to hear confessions. And he can grant absolution even for some pretty serious sins. But the interesting thing is that he seems to be quite lenient in terms of the penances he gives, especially if someone makes a generous donation to his order.
It's a little bit of quid pro quo going on there.
It does seem that way. A hefty purse full of coins can really smooth the path to forgiveness, especially if your heart isn't as contrite as your wallet. And then there's this curious little detail that he carries around, knives and pins to give as gifts to attractive wives. And we're not really told explicitly, what he expects in return.
Yeah.
But it does paint a rather suggestive picture of this friar. And to top it all off, he's also a very skilled musician. He plays the guitar and he plays the lute. He can sing all the popular ballads. So, he really likes to entertain and to be entertained.
So he's really enjoying kind of the finer things in life. But you mentioned earlier that he kind of avoids the poor and the sick.
He does. He much prefers to keep company with tavern keepers and wealthy individuals. And he explains this by saying that, as a confessor, he needs to be on good terms with the more influential members of his, congregation, the people who can offer him support. And, wherever there's a chance of making a profitable connection, he can be exceedingly polite and virtuous.
It's all very strategic. So he's very good at getting these donations.
He is. Even the poorest widow, it seems, would give him something. His opening line apparently was in principio in the beginning, and that always seemed to work. And he was quite playful, apparently, like a puppy, as Chaucer describes him. And, on love days, when disputes were settled out of court, he was always there acting as a mediator. So, really a very different image from the kind of secluded monk that we might imagine.
Yeah, very much a man of the people in a very specific
In a
sense.
very specific sense.
Okay, so that's the friar. Now we also have the cook. He's been hired by these worthy citizens
Hmm.
for the pilgrimage. And, I mean, food is pretty important on a long journey. So can you tell us about him?
Well, he's clearly a skilled cook. We're told about this delicious chicken pudding that he makes with a secret recipe. And Chaucer himself has tasted it, and he says it's fantastic. It's got, marrow bones and milk and eggs and ginger and spices, all kinds of good stuff.
Mm.
And he's also, an expert in all the different cooking techniques. Roasting, broiling, frying, making stews and pies. But then Chaucer throws in this little detail that he has a large festering ulcer on his leg.
Oh, ew.
Yeah, it's kind of a jarring detail,
Yeah.
especially, given that he's preparing food for everyone. I think maybe Chaucer's trying to tell us that, even someone who seems very skilled and successful can still have these hidden flaws.
Yeah, it's like a little reminder that nobody's perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to maybe one of the most memorable characters from the Canterbury Tales, the wife of Bath.
Ah, yes, the wife of Bath. She's quite a character. So first of all, we're told that she's an incredibly skilled cloth maker. She can make cloth that's even better than the famous weavers of Ypres and Ghent. And she's clearly very proud of this skill.
Yeah, and she's described as being a little bit deaf.
Yes, slightly deaf and maybe a bit proud as well. She would be furious if any other woman in the parish dared to make an offering at church before her. And her Sunday best is something else. She wears these fine linen head coverings that could weigh up to 10 pounds, and these bright red stockings tightly laced, and very fashionable leather shoes.
She sounds very stylish.
She does. She clearly takes pride in her appearance. And her face is described as being bold and ruddy, which maybe isn't surprising given her rather extensive marital history.
Right. 5 husbands?
5 husbands, all married in the church,
Yeah.
and numerous other, relationships in her younger days.
Though the narrator politely declines to go into detail about those.
Yes, he does. He does. And she's also a very experienced pilgrim. She's been to Jerusalem 3 times. She's crossed the sea many times. She's been to Rome, Bologna, Santiago de Compostela, Cologne. So, she's seen a good bit of the world, which would have been very unusual for a woman in those days.
Yeah, she's definitely independent and well-traveled.
She is.
And the narrator even mentions this old saying that gap-toothed women are inclined to be lustful.
Yes. Although he doesn't necessarily confirm whether this applies to the wife of Bath or not.
It's an interesting detail.
It is. It is. And then we get a description of her riding outfit. She sits very comfortably on her horse. She wears a fine wimple, a wide hat. She's got an overskirt and spurs on her boots. So, she's very much in control. And she's described as being jovial and friendly. But she seems to have a particular interest in the narrator. She's eager to discuss tales of, lost love, and she even touches his hand at one point while she's telling a story. So she's a very intriguing character.
Okay, so we've got the friar, we've got the cook, we've got the wife of Bath. Now let's move on to the parson, who is very different from these other 3. What makes him stand out?
Well, the person is presented as this really virtuous and learned man of the church. He's from a rural parish, and he's described as being poor in material wealth but rich in holy thought and works. He's a very dedicated preacher. He teaches his parishioners about devotion, and he's always kind and diligent and patient even when things are difficult.
Yeah, and he seems really selfless too.
Yeah.
He refuses to excommunicate anyone who can't pay their tithes, and he would rather give his own possessions to the poor than take from those who are struggling.
Yeah, he's very much a shepherd to his flock. And he's content with his modest living, even though his parish is very large and the houses are widely scattered. And nothing, not even, bad weather can prevent him from visiting his parishioners when they need him.
So he really puts their needs above his own comfort.
Absolutely. And he's a big believer in leading by example. He says, if gold rusts, what then will iron do? Using that to emphasize how important it is for the clergy to be virtuous. Because if the people who are supposed to be spiritual leaders are corrupt, then what hope is there for everyone else?
That's right.
And, he doesn't seek out a more, lucrative or comfortable position elsewhere. He stays with his community. He protects them from the wolves of sin and greed, as Chaucer puts it. And even though he is a righteous man, he doesn't treat sinners with contempt. He's very compassionate and courteous to them. He wants to draw them to God through kindness, although he can be quite stern with those who are stubbornly unrepentant.
So there's a balance there.
There
He's
is.
got that kind of tough love thing going on.
Yeah, and the narrator clearly has a lot of respect for the parson. He's almost awestruck by him, and I think the parson really represents this ideal of what a priest should be, someone who's humble and devout and truly cares about his community.
Okay, so we've met some of our key players now,
We have.
and the storytelling begins. As we said, the knight gets to go first. So what kind of a story does he tell?
Well, as befitting his status as a knight, his tale is a grand romance. It's set in ancient Greece, in Thebes and Athens, and it's all about courtly love and warfare.
Very appropriate for a knight.
Indeed. So the story centers on these two imprisoned knights, Palamon and Arcite, and they both fall in love with Emily, who is the sister-in-law of Theseus, the Duke of Athens.
So we've got a love triangle already.
We do. And Arcite is eventually released from prison, but he's banished from Athens, while Palamon remains imprisoned. And they're both, heartbroken over their separation from Emily.
But as in any good story, there's a twist.
There is. Arcite, driven by love, returns to Athens in disguise, and
Oh.
he becomes a squire in Theseus's court. And he's very careful to conceal his true identity.
Okay.
Meanwhile, Palamon manages to escape from prison. And in a very dramatic scene, the two rivals encounter each other in a forest.
What are the chances?
I know. And of course, they immediately start fighting over Emily. Their true identities are revealed. And, their rivalry just explodes. And they're so caught up in this, this love and this anger that they decide to have a duel the next day.
So their love for Emily is leading to some pretty dangerous behavior.
It is. However, Theseus discovers their plan and he's furious. He initially sentences them both to death for fighting without his permission, but the women in his court plead for their lives. And Theseus relents, and instead he decrees that they will have a grand tournament to decide who will win Emily's hand.
So it goes from this very private, personal duel to this big public spectacle.
Exactly. And Theseus spends a whole year preparing for this tournament. He builds this enormous amphitheater, a mile in circumference, with raised seating for all the spectators. And then within the amphitheater, he has these elaborate altars and shrines constructed. There's one to Venus on the east, Mars on the west, and then a beautiful temple to Diana in the north.
So he's really pulling out all the stops for this.
He is. And the descriptions of these temples are really fascinating. The Temple of Venus is filled with images of, the sorrows of love and stories like the tragedy of Narcissus. The Temple of Mars is all about war and, destruction and violent death. And then Diana's temple is dedicated to chastity and the hunt. There's even an image of the nymph Callisto who is transformed into a bear. So all of these visual details really enrich the story and kind of foreshadow what's going to happen.
Yeah, very symbolic.
They are. So then on the night before the tournament, each of the knights goes to one of these temples to pray.
Okay.
Palamon goes to Venus and he prays for Emily's love, even if it means losing the battle. Emily herself goes to Diana's temple and she prays that she can remain unmarried. Or if she must marry, that she will marry the one who truly loves her the most.
So she's not really picking sides.
No, she's not. And then Arcite goes to the Temple of Mars and he prays for victory in the tournament. So each of them has a different desire.
So the big day arrives. How does the tournament play out?
Well, it's a spectacular event, of course. And in the end, Arcite is victorious. But just as he's claiming his triumph, a fury sent by Pluto at the request of Saturn causes his horse to stumble and throw him.
Oh, no.
I know, and Arcite is fatally injured.
So even though he wins the tournament, he doesn't get the girl.
No, he doesn't. And in his dying moments, he asks Theseus to allow Emily to marry Palamon. Theseus is, understandably devastated by Arcite's death, but his father Aegis convinces him to accept it as, the natural order of things. And so they hold a grand funeral for Arcite. And eventually Palamon and Emily do marry with Theseus's blessing.
Okay, so it's a very bittersweet ending.
It is.
Now, how do the other pilgrims react to the Knight's Tale?
Well, some of them have some interesting responses. The Franklin, for example, reflects on how, life is like an inn and death is like the end of the journey.
So he's taking a much more kind of philosophical approach to it?
He is. And the Reeve just says, Amen, and expresses a wish for a good death. So, they're both kind of thinking about mortality in a way that's very different from the Knight's, focus on heroism and romance.
Right. And later on, when the miller tells his tale, The reeve gets very upset.
Yes, he does. He interrupts the Miller's story, and he calls it lewd nonsense. He objects to the fact that it's, disrespectful of people's reputations,
Hmm.
especially the reputation of wives. And this really reveals the tension between different social classes in this group.
Because the miller is not really known for his, refined tastes.
No.
And he's pretty drunk at this point.
He is.
So how does he respond to the reeve's criticism?
Well, he defends his story. And he actually, doubles down on the very things that the Reeves found offensive. He talks about wives and cuckoldry. And this really highlights the potential for conflict within this diverse group of travelers.
Yeah, and shows that, they're not just passively listening to these stories. They're actively engaging with them. They're debating them.
Right. And we get glimpses of other tales as well. The Miller's own tale is about this guy named Nicholas and his affair with a woman named Allison who is married to a carpenter. And it involves, a faked flood and a trick with a hot iron.
Sounds pretty bawdy.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. And then his second tale is about this proud miller named Simpkin and some stolen flour. And it's full of, trickery and revenge.
So very different from the knight's very elevated tale.
Very different.
Much more grounded in everyday life.
Exactly.
And then there's a tale about a dishonest apprentice who steals from his master. And then we have this very interesting moment where the man of law refuses to tell a story.
Yes, he claims that Chaucer has already told all the best stories. He even criticizes Chaucer's writing a little bit.
He's like, why bother? Chaucer's already done it all.
Exactly. Although he does acknowledge that Chaucer is, very prolific. He mentions the legend of good women and all these other stories about, ill-fated lovers.
So a bit of a backhanded compliment there.
Yeah, it's very funny.
Mm.
And this leads us to the Merchant's Tale, which is another very interesting take on marriage.
Okay, so what happens in the Merchant's Tale?
Well, it tells the story of this aging knight January who decides to get married. But he's not really looking for love or companionship. He just wants a young, beautiful wife to satisfy his desires.
So his motives are not entirely pure.
Not entirely. And he actually, lists out all the qualities he's looking for in a wife. She has to be young and attractive and modest and obedient. And he completely ignores the advice of his friends who tell him that, marrying for these reasons is foolish.
So he's blinded by lust.
He is. And so he finds this young woman named May and he marries her. And then soon after the wedding, we're introduced to Damien, who is January's squire. And Damien falls head over heels in love with May.
So I've got another love triangle.
Another love triangle. And May and Damien start exchanging secret messages. And May is very impatient, during this, this traditional period of seclusion after the wedding. And then Damien writes her this, passionate love letter in verse. And he manages to sneak it to her.
Okay, so things are starting to heat up.
They are. And then there's this scene where May and Damien meet secretly in the garden. And January is there too. But he's blind at this point in the story. And he's holding May's hand thinking that, they're having this private romantic moment. But actually, she's sneaking around with Damien behind his back.
Oh, the irony.
I know. And then the gods get involved. Pluto and Proserpine are listening to all this. And Pluto is so disgusted by January's, confident belief that May is faithful to him that he decides to expose her infidelity. But Proserpine decides to help May out. And she promises to give her, a clever excuse to explain away her actions.
So it's like a battle of the sexes, even among the gods.
Yeah, exactly. And so as May is actually, in the act of being unfaithful to January with Damien in a pear tree, Pluto restores January's sight.
Oh, no.
I know. But thanks to Proserpine, May is able to talk her way out of it. She convinces January that, his vision is still blurry and he didn't really see what he thought he saw.
So she's very quick-witted.
She is. And it's a pretty cynical take on marriage, I would say.
Yeah, very different from the Knight's Tale.
Very different. And this leads us to the wife of Bath, who has some very strong opinions on the subject of marriage, as we've already heard.
Right. And her prologue is almost as famous as her actual tale.
It is. It's this amazing piece of writing where she just lays out all of her views on male authority and female desire. She talks about her 5 husbands. And she uses all these biblical and historical examples to support her arguments.
And she's not afraid to boast about how she was able to control her husbands.
No, she's not. She used her wit. She sometimes even made false accusations. And she presents herself as, a woman who lived life on her own terms.
Okay.
And And one of her most significant marriages was to this man named Jenkin, who was a scholar. And he would read aloud to her from this book that was full of, misogynistic stories. Um, and this led to a lot of arguments between them. And eventually, Jenkin actually hit her, and she became deaf in one ear.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was a very violent relationship. But she tells us how she eventually gained the upper hand. She tore pages out of his book. And from that point on, she says, he gave her sovereignty in the marriage.
So she fought for her own autonomy.
She did. And her actual tale echoes this theme of, female power in relationships. It's about this knight who commits a terrible crime, and he's given a year and a day to figure out what women truly desire.
Okay, that's a tough one.
It is. It is. And he goes all over the place asking people, but no one can give him a satisfactory answer. And finally, he meets this old hag, this crone. And she tells him that what women really want is sovereignty over their husbands.
So it's the same message that the wife of Bath herself has been advocating for.
Exactly. But in exchange for this knowledge, the crone demands that the knight marry her.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so he's forced into this marriage with this, old and ugly woman. And he's miserable at first. But then when he finally gives her the choice, he says, you can choose what you want. She transforms into this beautiful young woman.
It's a pretty clear message there.
It is. It is. And the friar is not happy about this at all. He objects to the wife of Bath's, her very outspoken views on marriage and her criticism of the clergy. So he decides to tell a story about a summoner.
Right, because summoners were not exactly the most popular people in medieval society.
No, they weren't. They were these officials who basically went around, accusing people of, fornication and adultery and other, moral crimes. And they all often extort money from people. So they weren't very well liked.
Yeah, they had a pretty bad reputation.
He did.
So what happens in the Friar's Tale?
Well, it's about this summoner who meets a bailiff who is actually a fiend in disguise. And the fiend explains that, devils can take any form they want. And then they agree to, to share whatever they earn through their wicked deeds. And the fiend makes this very interesting comment that, it's not what you say that matters, it's what you intend.
So your thoughts are just as important as your actions.
Right. And then the summoner tries to extort money from this old woman by falsely accusing her of some crime. And the woman is so angry and frustrated that she curses him. She says, I can sign you and your money to the devil. And the fiend immediately appears and drags the summoner down to hell.
Because he was truly wicked in his intentions.
Yeah. Exactly. So it's a very different message from the wife of Bath's tale.
Yeah, very different. Now, the next tale is the Clerk's Tale, which offers a completely different perspective on marriage. What's this one about?
Well, this one is about a woman named Griselda, who is known for her patience. She marries this marquis named Walter, and Walter decides to test her obedience in some really cruel ways.
Oh, no. How does he do that?
Well, first he pretends that their baby daughter has to be killed. And then later, he does the same thing with their son.
Oh, that's terrible.
I know. And then he pretends to divorce Griselda and marry a new younger bride.
What?
Yeah, and throughout all of this, Griselda is incredibly obedient and patient. She never complains. She never questions Walter's decisions. And eventually, Walter reveals that, the children are actually safe. He's just been hiding them away. And he praises Griselda for her, extraordinary fidelity.
But it seems like a very strange way to prove her loyalty.
It does. It does. And the clerk actually acknowledges this at the end of the tale. He adds this little envoy where he advises wives to not be so obedient.
So he's kind of undercutting the message of the story a little bit.
He is. He is. Which I think is really interesting. It shows that, even in the Middle Ages, people were debating these ideas about, what the ideal marriage should be like.
Right.
And then we have the Nun's Priest's Tale, which is a much lighter story. It's about a rooster named Chanticleer and his favorite hen Pertologa.
Okay, animals now.
Animals now. So Chanticleer has this dream about a fox, and he's very worried that it's a bad omen. But Pertoletta tells him not to worry about dreams. She says, they're just caused by, indigestion or other physical ailments.
So she's very practical.
She is. But Chanticleer argues that dreams can be prophetic, and he gives all these historical examples to support his point.
So there's like a little debate about the meaning of dreams.
Yeah, and then this fox named Dan Russell appears, and he's very cunning. And he uses flattery to trick Chanticleer into closing his eyes and singing. And while Chanticleer is singing with his eyes closed, the fox grabs him and runs off.
Oh, no.
Yeah, but Chanticleer is clever too. He tricks the fox into opening his mouth to boast about how he's captured the rooster. And when the fox opens his mouth, Chanticleer escapes.
So he gets the last laugh.
He does. He does. And the moral of the story is, beware of flattery.
Yep.
And don't act impulsively.
Good advice.
Yeah. And then we have the second nun's tale, which is about the life of Saint Cecilia.
So back to the religious theme.
Back to the religious thing. And Cecilia is a very devout Christian, and she converts her husband Valerian and his brother Tiburce to Christianity. And she has this amazing ability to see her guardian angel. And she actually persuades Valerian to be baptized so that he can see the angel too.
Okay.
But then the brothers are arrested and they're ordered to sacrifice to the pagan gods, and they refuse. And so they're martyred for their faith.
So very different kind of story from the nun's priest's tale.
Very different.
Yeah.
And then we have the canon's yeoman's tale, which is about this alchemist who is actually a fraud.
Okay.
And the canon's yeoman tells us all about, the tricks that alchemists would use to deceive people, how they would pretend to turn lead into gold. And he warns us against, falling for these scams.
So it's kind of cautionary tale about greed and deception.
It is. It is. And then we have the Manciple's tale, which is a very short tale about a crow that can talk.
A talking crow.
Yeah. And the crow reveals that his master's wife has been unfaithful.
Oh, no.
Yeah. And the master is so angry that he kills the crow. But then he finds out that the crow is telling the truth and he regrets his actions.
So the moral of the story is think before you act.
Exactly. Don't shoot the messenger. And finally, we have the Person's Tale, which is actually a prose sermon about penitence.
So a very appropriate ending for a pilgrimage.
It is. It is.
Okay, so as you can see, there's a lot going on in the Canterbury Tales.
There is. It's an amazing work. And I think what's so fascinating is how each of these tales, not only entertains, but also gives us this window into, the values and beliefs and social dynamics of medieval England.
Yeah, we see this clash between, the ideals of chivalry and the realities of everyday life. We see religious devotion alongside, and we see humor used in all sorts of different ways, to make us laugh, to make us think, to kind of critique society.
Yeah.
And the little details that Chaucer gives us, like the cook's ulcer or, the intricate schemes in the merchants and the canon's yeoman's tales, they really bring this world to life.
They do. And I think, these surprising details, these moments where we're like, huh? I didn't expect that. That's what makes this work so engaging. And it helps us to, to really understand this period in history without feeling like we're, bogged down in a textbook.
Exactly. And the fact that there are all these different viewpoints, we've got the knight's perspective, the wife of Bath's perspective, the friar's perspective, and they're all kind of talking to each other and arguing with each other. It makes it feel so dynamic and real.
It does. And I think, the humor that's woven throughout these tales is also really important because it reminds us that, even though these people lived in a very different time, they were still human beings with, the same flaws and foibles that we have today.
Right. So we hope that this deep dive has given you a better appreciation for the richness and complexity of the Canterbury Tales, but we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to discover in this work.
There is. And I think, the best way to really appreciate the Canterbury Tales is to just dive in and read it for yourself. And as you're reading, think about the motivations of each pilgrim. Think about how their tales reflect their own personalities and their place in society. And see what other connections and insights you can uncover.
Exactly. Because there's always something new to discover in Chaucer.
There is.
So happy reading, everyone.
Happy reading.